There is a particular kind of fear that does not come from the dark, or from heights, or from things that move too fast for the eye to follow. It is a slower fear, a geological fear, the kind that settles into you when you are standing in a landscape, and you realize that the silence around you is not natural silence, but the silence left behind when something enormous stopped existing. Australia is full of that silence. It is a continent that was once populated by creatures so large, so lethal, and so ecologically dominant that the world they shaped is almost unrecognizable compared to what replaced it. And then, in a compressed window of geological time, most of them were gone. What remained was a landscape haunted by the ecological ghosts of animals that had spent millions of years building food webs, carving niches, and shaping the behavior of everything around them. The creatures on this list are not science fiction. They are not exaggerations. Every one of them has been documented in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, reconstructed from fossil bones, from teeth, from trackways, from stomach contents preserved in sediment, from ancient DNA, and from the ecological ripple effects their disappearance left behind in a continent that has never quite recovered. What I want you to understand, before we begin, is not just how terrifying these animals were in isolation. I want you to understand what it meant for entire species, entire ecosystems, entire branches of the tree of life, when creatures like these were removed from the equation. Because extinction does not happen in a vacuum. Every species that disappears takes a piece of the world with it. And some of these animals took entire worlds. Number 10, Kalankan, and the shadow of the terror birds. Before we reach Australia's own giants, we need to spend a moment with a group of animals whose story casts a long shadow over the entire concept of apex predation in isolated landmasses. The Ferucia resids, known colloquially as terror birds, were a family of enormous, flightless, predatory birds that dominated South America for tens of millions of years. The largest known species, Kalankan guillemot, described from fossils found in Patagonia and published by researchers from the Museo Egidio, Ferrogalileo, in Argentina, in Argentina, stood approximately 3 meters tall and possessed a skull larger than that of most horses, with a hooked beak capable of delivering strikes with the force and speed of a modern hatchet blow. Kalankan did not belong to Australia. But the reason it opens this list is that Australia produced its own convergent equivalent, a lineage of giant predatory birds that evolved independently on a continent where mammals had not yet filled the role of large terrestrial hunter. The Dromornithids, the Mahirungs, were not quite the same as terror birds, but the ecological logic that produced them was identical. When mammals are absent or small, birds grow into the space left behind. They grow large, they grow fast. And in Australia, on a continent that had been isolated from the rest of the world for tens of millions of years, that process ran longer and reached further than anywhere else on Earth. Keep Kalankan in mind as we move forward. It is the template. What follows are the Australian variations. Number 9, Dromornis sturtni, the demon duck of doom. The name is partly affectionate and partly accurate. Dromornis sturtni was the largest bird that ever lived, standing nearly 3 meters tall and weighing an estimated 650 kilograms, more than twice the weight of an ostrich, more than the combined weight of 4 adult men. It belonged to a family called the Dromornithids, and it roamed the open woodlands and floodplains of central Australia during the Miocene epoch, between roughly 5 and 15 million years ago. Fossils of Dromornis have been found primarily in the Alcuda fossil site in the Northern Territory, which was excavated over many years by teams from Museum Victoria and the South Australian Museum, with key research published by Peter Murray and colleagues establishing the basic biology and ecology of these birds. Despite the nickname and its intimidating size, Dromornis was almost certainly not an apex predator in the traditional sense. The structure of its beak suggests it was primarily herbivorous, or at least omnivorous, a grazer of enormous plants, and possibly a crusher of tough seeds and roots. But do not let that reassure you too much. An animal weighing 650 kilograms, with legs like tree trunks, and a beak capable of snapping bone, does not need to be a dedicated predator to be existentially dangerous. The ecological role of Dromornis in its time was that of a living bulldozer. It consumed plant material at a rate and scale that shaped the vegetation of entire regions. And when it disappeared, along with the rest of its family, it left behind an ecological vacancy that nothing has ever adequately filled. The plants that Dromornis had spent millions of years co-evolving with suddenly had no large animal to disperse their seeds, no force to open their tough-husked fruits, no browser heavy enough to keep the canopy from closing. Some of those plant lineages are still dealing with the consequences today. Number 8. Thylocoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion that hunted in silence. If you were to design a predator from scratch, optimizing purely for lethality relative to body size, you would probably arrive at something very close to Thylacoleo carnifex. The marsupial lion was not the largest predator Australia has ever produced, but it was almost certainly the most efficient killer, and the fossil record strongly suggests it was the dominant apex predator on this continent for millions of years, right up until its extinction, approximately 46,000 years ago, coinciding closely with the arrival of modern humans. Research by Stephen Rowe at the University of New South Wales, using finite element analysis to model the biomechanics of the Thylacoleo skull, established that this animal had the most powerful bite of any known mammal relative to its body size in the fossil record. The teeth of Thylacoleo were not like those of any other carnivore alive today. Instead of canines for stabbing and molars for crushing, it had evolved a pair of enormous, blade-like premolars, the largest of any mammal ever recorded, that functioned as shearing tools of extraordinary precision. A single lateral slice from those teeth through the throat of a prey animal would have been instantly fatal. The forelimbs of Thylacoleo were equally remarkable. Analysis published by Christine Argo at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris showed that the limb proportions and joint morphology indicated an animal adapted not just for ground pursuit but for climbing, with semi-retractile claws on the front feet that matched the grip of a modern leopard. This was a predator that could hunt from trees and from the ground, that could take prey much larger than itself by using the element of surprise and the precision of its weaponized dentition. A large Thylacoleo, approaching 160 kilograms, could almost certainly kill a diprotodon juvenile, and may have regularly done so. When Thylacoleo went extinct, the entire prey community of Australia reorganized. Animals that had spent hundreds of thousands of generations evolving behavioral defenses against a silent ambush predator that could come from any direction, including above, suddenly had no such predator to defend against. That release from predation pressure changed everything that followed. Number 7. Megalania prisca, the dragon that was real. There are moments in paleontology when the gap between the animal that existed and the animal a human mind can comfortably imagine becomes impossible to bridge. Megalania prisca is one of those moments. Megalania was a monitor lizard, a relative of the Komodo dragon, that lived in Australia until approximately 40,000 years ago. The question of its exact size has been debated for decades, primarily because the fossils are fragmentary and the scaling methods used to estimate total body length from partial remains differ between researchers. The conservative estimates, using published work by Ralph Molnar at the Queensland Museum and more recent analyses by Brian Fry at the University of Queensland, put the maximum length at between 5 and 7 meters, with body mass estimates ranging from 320 kilograms to over 600 kilograms. The less conservative estimates, which some researchers argue are supported by the fragmentary fossil material, suggest animals potentially approaching 8 meters in length at any point in that range. Megalania was the largest terrestrial lizard that has ever existed on Earth, not by a small margin, but by a factor that makes it categorically different from any living relative. Komodo dragons kill large mammals. They have been documented killing horses, water buffalo, and humans. Megalania was built on the same plan: predatory ambush, venom delivery through a complex oral gland system similar to that described by Brian Fry's research on varanids, and a body large enough to consume prey the size of a large kangaroo whole. The prey species that evolved alongside Megalania for millions of years developed a set of behavioral responses to a very large, very patient, very well camouflaged ambush predator. When Megalania disappeared, those behavioral adaptations became vestigial. The knowledge of how to avoid a 7-meter ambush lizard, encoded in the instinctive behavior of dozens of species, went from being life-saving information to evolutionary baggage. In some cases, prey species responded by relaxing vigilance behaviors that had been selected for over millions of years. In a world without Megalania, that relaxation was fine. In a world where a new kind of predator was arriving from the north, it was not. Number 6. Quincana forterostrum, the land crocodile. When most people think of crocodiles, they think of water. A crocodile in your imagination is a thing of rivers and billabongs, a patient ambush predator whose domain is the shoreline and the shallows. That association is correct for every crocodilian alive today. It was not correct for all of Australia's prehistoric crocodilians. Quincana forterostrum was a Mecasuchian crocodile, belonging to an entirely extinct subfamily that was characterized by a body plan fundamentally different from modern crocodilians. Where modern crocodiles have sprawling limbs designed for the slow, belly-dragging locomotion of an animal that spends most of its time in water, Quincana had long, column-like legs set more directly beneath its body, giving it a gait closer to a large terrestrial mammal than to any living crocodile. Research by Paul Willis and colleagues, published through various paleontological journals over the past 3 decades, established the basic anatomy of Quincana and its relatives. And the picture that emerged was of an animal built for cursorial, meaning running, predation on dry land. Quincana reached lengths of up to 6 meters in its largest individuals, and its teeth were not the conical, fish-gripping teeth of a water predator, but laterally compressed, serrated, and blade-like, adapted for slicing through the flesh of terrestrial prey. This was a running crocodile that hunted on the open plains of Pleistocene Australia, and for the large herbivores that shared its habitat, it represented an entirely different threat profile than any ambush predator. It could pursue, it could chase. The Mecasuchine crocodiles as a group survived in Australia until sometime in the mid-Holocene, with some evidence suggesting certain species persisted until less than 2,000 years ago, which means they were contemporary with human populations on this continent for many thousands of years. The oral traditions of some Aboriginal communities include descriptions of large, dangerous land-dwelling reptiles that do not match any currently living species, a correspondence that some researchers have cautiously noted without drawing firm conclusions. Number 5. Palurchestes asail, the creature that should not have existed. Among all the strange and improbable animals that Australia produced during its long period of evolutionary isolation, Palurchestes stands apart for a particular reason. It was so anatomically unusual that early researchers examining its fossils genuinely did not know what kind of animal they were looking at. The first fossil material was fragmentary enough that it was initially classified as a giant kangaroo. When more complete material was eventually assembled and analyzed, what emerged was something that defied easy classification within any existing framework. Palurchestidae was a marsupial of the family Palurchestidae, related distantly to wombats and koalas, and it reached body masses of up to 500 kilograms in its larger individuals. But what made it genuinely extraordinary was its skull and forelimb anatomy. Reconstructions based on work by researchers, including Michael Archer at the University of New South Wales, suggest that Palurchestes had a short, taper-like trunk, or at minimum, a highly mobile, prehensile upper lip capable of grasping and stripping vegetation in the manner of a tapir or certain extinct horses. The forelimbs were massively built, with large, curved claws that were almost certainly used for pulling down branches and digging into bark. In a functional convergence with the giant ground sloths of South America, animals that evolved entirely independently on a different continent but arrived at almost identical ecological solutions. When Palurchestes disappeared approximately 40,000 years ago, it took with it an ecological function that no other Australian animal performed. It had been a specialized processor of tough, fibrous vegetation in specific microhabitats, the plants that had co-evolved with its feeding behavior. The trees, whose bark and branches it stripped in ways that promoted particular growth patterns, lost their partner in that relationship. Some researchers studying the vegetation history of eastern Australia have noted unusual shifts in plant community composition that occur in the fossil pollen record at roughly the time of Palurchestes' extinction. Shifts that have no clear climatic explanation but might make sense in the context of a lost ecological engineer. Number 4. Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial that ever lived. If you took a wombat and scaled it up to the size of a hippopotamus, you would have something approaching Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that has ever existed on this planet. Adults reached body masses of up to 2,800 kilograms, stood approximately 2 meters at the shoulder, and measured close to 4 meters from nose to tail. Diprotodon was a grazer and browser of the Pleistocene Australian landscape, and for the ecosystems it inhabited, it was the closest thing to a living geological force that biology can produce. Research by Gilbert Price at the University of Queensland, examining Diprotodon fossils from sites across eastern and central Australia, has demonstrated that these animals undertook seasonal migrations covering hundreds of kilometers, moving between inland plains during wetter periods and retreating to more productive coastal regions during dry seasons. Their migration routes, followed consistently for hundreds of thousands of years, would have created trails and grazing patterns that shaped the vegetation of entire regions. They were ecosystem engineers of continental scale. The disappearance of Diprotodon approximately 46,000 years ago was not just the loss of a single species. It was the removal of a force that had been structuring the Australian landscape for hundreds of thousands of years. The grasslands that Diprotodon had maintained through its grazing began to change. Shrubs that its bulk had suppressed began to expand. The fire regime of the continent, which had been partly regulated by the amount and distribution of dry grass fuel that Diprotodon consumed, shifted. Some researchers, including David Bowman at the University of Tasmania, have argued that the altered fire ecology of modern Australia, characterized by more intense, and more frequent large fires than the continent experienced during the Pleistocene, is partly a consequence of losing the giant herbivores that had kept fuel loads in check. The bushfires that Australians live with today, the ones that make international headlines with their ferocity and scale, may carry within them a distant echo of an extinction that happened 46,000 years ago. Number 3. 1Ambi, Naracotensis, the ambush serpent of the watering holes. In the limestone cave systems of South Australia, at a site called the Naracoorte Caves, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most important fossil deposits in the Southern Hemisphere, paleontologists excavating through layers of Pleistocene sediment found the bones of a snake so large that for many years its true size was considered almost implausible. 1Ambi, Naracotensis, belonged to an extinct family of giant constrictors called the Madsoids, an ancient lineage with deep Gondwanan roots that had been present in Australia since before the continent separated from Antarctica. Research by John Scanlon and Michael Lee, published through various paleontological venues, including work at the South Australian Museum, established that 1Ambi reached lengths of approximately 5 to 6 meters, with a body mass and girth consistent with a large modern python. But 1Ambi was not a python, and its hunting strategy appears to have been significantly different. Analysis of its skull structure suggests it may have been less capable of the extreme jaw gape of modern constrictors, which some researchers have interpreted as evidence that 1Ambi was an ambush predator that relied on constriction and drowning rather than simply swallowing large prey. The watering holes and permanent water sources of Pleistocene Australia, places where every large herbivore on the continent had to come to drink, would have been ideal hunting grounds for an ambush constrictor of this size. Diprotodon, giant kangaroos, wombats, the size of cattle, all of them came to drink, and at the water's edge, 1Ambi waited. The last Madsoid snakes disappeared from the Australian fossil record sometime around 50,000 years ago, a date that again overlaps uncomfortably closely with the arrival of modern humans on the continent. Whether human hunting pressure, habitat change, or the loss of the large prey species that 1Ambi depended on drove its extinction is not established. What is established is that a lineage of giant ambush serpents that had been part of the Australian ecosystem for tens of millions of years was gone within a geologically brief period of time after a new and very capable predator arrived. Number 2. Procoptodon golia, the short-faced giant. There is something about Procoptodon golia that the fossil record captures with unusual clarity, because we have not just bones, but trackways, associated environmental data, and enough skeletal material from multiple individuals to reconstruct this animal with real confidence. Procoptodon was the largest kangaroo that has ever existed, standing approximately 2 meters tall at the head when upright, with a total body mass estimated at around 240 kilograms, roughly 3 times the weight of a large modern red kangaroo. But size alone does not explain why Procoptodon merits a place near the top of this list. What makes it extraordinary is the combination of its scale with its extraordinary specialization. The face of Procoptodon was radically shortened compared to any modern kangaroo, with forward-facing eyes that provided binocular vision, an adaptation more commonly seen in predators than in grazers. The forelimbs were long and equipped with 2 large, elongated digits that functioned as hooks, capable of reaching up to 5 meters above the ground to pull down high-browse vegetation that no other ground-based herbivore could access. Research by Gavin Preto at Flinders University, examining Procoptodon fossils from multiple sites across southern Australia, established that this animal was a highly specialized browser of saltbush and chenopod shrublands, an ecosystem type that covered vast areas of inland Australia during the Pleistocene. When Procoptodon disappeared, approximately 46,000 years ago, the saltbush ecosystem lost its primary large herbivore, the animal whose feeding habits had been shaping the distribution and density of those plants for hundreds of thousands of years. The ecological consequences cascaded through the food web. Thylacoleo and Megalania, which almost certainly preyed on Procoptodon, lost a significant prey resource. The vegetation community shifted, and the silence that followed. The absence of a 240-kilogram kangaroo moving through the saltbush at dawn was just one more thread pulled from a tapestry that had taken millions of years to weave. Number 1. The extinction event itself, and what it tells us about the silence. Number 1 on this list is not a single creature. It is the moment when almost all of them vanished at once, and what that moment has to tell us about the kind of force it takes to erase entire ecosystems. Between approximately 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, Australia lost more than 85% of its large animal species in what researchers call the late Quaternary megafauna extinction. The animals we have discussed, Thylacoleo, Megalonia, Diprotodon, Procoptodon, Wanambi, Quincana, Palachests, and dozens of others, were gone within a period that in geological terms was virtually instantaneous. The cause of this extinction has been one of the most intensely debated questions in Australian science for the past 50 years. On one side, researchers including Tim Flannery, whose book The Future Eaters popularized the human overkill hypothesis, have argued that the arrival of modern humans on the continent, approximately 50,000 years ago, was the primary driver, through direct hunting of naive prey species that had no evolutionary experience of a bipedal hunter using projectile weapons. On the other side, researchers including Judith Field at the University of New South Wales and others have emphasized the role of climate change, pointing to evidence that the period of extinction coincided with increasing aridity across the Australian interior and significant shifts in fire regime. The current scientific consensus, reflected in major reviews, including work by Barry Brook at the University of Tasmania and published in journals including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, is that the extinction was most likely caused by the interaction of both forces. Human arrival triggered initial population declines in prey species. Climate change, operating on a landscape that had already been destabilized by the loss of its large herbivores, accelerated those declines into irreversible collapse. Neither factor alone is sufficient to explain the pattern of extinction. Together, they produced a cascade that unraveled a biological community 50 million years in the making within a few thousand years. What we are left with is a continent that carries the ecological memory of a world that no longer exists. The plants that evolved with Diprotodon still produce fruits with no animal large enough to eat them. The grasslands that Procoptodon maintained are gone. The watering holes where Wanambi hunted are dry. And the silence that you hear when you stand in the Australian outback at dusk, that immense, specific, layered silence, is partly the silence of everything that should be there, and is not. The world that existed before those 46,000 years ago was not inferior to the one we have now. It was extraordinary. And it is gone. Understanding why it is gone, rigorously, honestly, without flinching from the implications of the evidence, is not just a scientific obligation. It is an act of respect for the world that was lost, and possibly the most important lesson this continent has to teach the rest of the world about what happens when the forces that shape ecosystems are suddenly, irreversibly removed. The animals on this list are not cautionary tales from another planet. They are part of the real history of the continent you live on, or the continent some of you are watching from a distance, with the particular kind of longing that wild places inspire in people who have spent too long in cities. Australia is not just old, it is wounded in ways that are still healing, or perhaps not healing at all. Because the ecological engineers that drove the healing processes are gone, but the bones are still there. In limestone caves, and river sediments, and desert dunes, the record of these animals is being assembled, one fossil fragment at a time, by researchers who understand that the history of life on this continent is one of the most important stories on Earth. If this kind of content reaches something in you, if you find yourself wanting to go further back and understand more of what was lost and what remains, stay with this channel. We are nowhere near finished.